In this third and final podcast on morals and markets, I am in conversation with Victoria Bateman. Victoria grew up in Oldham, one of the centres of the Industrial Revolution, and studied economics at the University of Cambridge, where until recently she was teaching the subject and economic history. Her work has focused on why Europe, and especially Britain, became relatively prosperous and diverged from other parts of the world. Above all, as we will hear in our conversation, she calls for a sexual revolution in economics to understand the importance of women. The title of one of her important books indicates her central claim. I have it here in front of me: The Sex Factor, How Women Made the West Rich. And she's continued her investigations in her most recent book, Naked Feminism, Breaking the Cult of Female Modesty. And we look forward to a new book, which Victoria just told me she's just completed the first editing of it, so it'll be out in 2025. The new book is on Economica, a global history of women, wealth and power. So I'm looking forward to the next hour or so talking to you, Victoria, about some of the themes in your work. So let me start by picking up one of the themes in your first book, the title of that first, subtitle of that first book, How Women Made the West Rich. So in recent decades, there's been a whole slew of books, a whole library of books in economic history and in economics about why the West, and England and Northwest Europe in particular, became rich. How did they diverge from parts of Asia? What Ken Pomerantz has called the Great Divergence. Now, various reasons have been suggested for that divergence, and some of the literature that I'm aware of talks about the ability of Northwest Europe to escape from ecological constraints by adding inputs from the colonies or by inserting coal as an additional energy with whatever long-term consequences that might have for global warming, moving away from an organic economy. And I think it was last month, the month before that perhaps, the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, James Robinson. And they suggest another reason why the West diverged: the spread of property rights and institutions through British colonialism. Now, I think it'd be fair to say your interpretation differs from all of those, and you think that economics has neglected a major issue. So could you explain why you think it was women who made the West rich?
Thank you, Martin. Such a great and such an important question. And perhaps I should begin really by breaking a common assumption, that is that the West has always been best, because we know that for most of history, Europe was a backwater and Britain was a backwater to the backwater, and all of the interesting economic action was taking place way overseas, whether it was in China, India and Pakistan, the Middle East and ancient Egypt, Peru, perhaps we should throw into the mix. And so how Britain, a tiny little island on the edge of Europe, managed to transform itself from rags to riches, and how that in turn feeds into the rise of the West, it is such an important question. It's probably the biggest miracle of economic history. And as you say, there are lots of different answers out there, and economic historians are still, to a degree, scratching their heads over how did Britain do it, and how did the West make this transition from being this backwater to being really the top of the global economic league table. So there are lots of different answers out there, and I would say that they all have one failing in common, and that is their neglect of women. I think actually if you look at what was different between particularly Northwestern Europe, and let's say Britain within that, and all of the historic global centres of the economy, the global economic hotspots, so China, the Middle East, India and Pakistan. If you look at what was different in Northwestern Europe, what I think most stands out is what was going on in women's lives, not what was going on in men's lives. And really, typically, when we think about the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the West, we do think about men's lives. We think about the male scientists, engineers, industrialists, traders that are cast in bronze as statues and put in the centre of our big industrial cities. And really we overlook the role of women in all of this. And what I argue in the sex factor is it was the relative freedoms that ordinary women possessed that gave Northwestern Europe this secret weapon that allowed it to not just catch up, but overtake these other parts of the world that had been there at the top of the global economy, not just for centuries, but for millennia. So if we think first of all about the typical woman's life in China, in the Middle East, in India and Pakistan, on the eve of the rise of the West, the average woman was married, and she was typically married off by her father and married off young. So she was then married into her husband's household, absorbed into her parents-in-law's household. Now, she was working very hard within that household, whether that was working on care for the family or whether that was, say, making cloth within the home. But she had very little control over her life. She had no control really over her marriage decision. She had no control over the type of work that she was doing. She had no ability to keep the rewards of the labour that she was doing within the home. No freedom to decide how to spend the family budget. Whereas if we think about women's lives in Northwestern Europe on the eve of the rise of the West, they really couldn't be more different. And so we know for Britain, for example, that the average woman went out to work in her teenage years. She might go into, say, agricultural service or into domestic service on, let's say, a 10-year service contract. She earned money. She was able to keep that money. She was working beyond her own family, developing an independent life for herself. And that financial independence enabled her to take full charge of the marriage decision. So she could decide for herself whether, when, and who to marry. And this had really important effects on the way families functioned. So what you have is a situation in which women are able to, because they're financially independent, stand up to the practice of being married off as teenagers, stand up to the practice of being absorbed into their parents-in-law's home, and so they can choose someone who they want to marry. They wait and they save until they're in a financially strong enough position to actually set down roots, start a family. And if we look in the parish records in churches across Britain, what we find is therefore that women are not getting married until their mid-20s. And we see this throughout the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. So the average young woman is out there working, earning her own living, and then she's taking charge of the marriage decision. And this, I think, has 4 or 5 big effects on the economy. So the first one is because women are marrying later in life, they have smaller families. And that helps to prevent excessive population pressure. And that in turn helps to maintain a society in which the standard of living is a little bit higher than subsistence, where the wage is higher than subsistence, and this provides an incentive for mechanisation and technological change. So I think actually the technological change that is going on during the course of the rise of the West, that so many economists see as so central to economic growth, actually is rooted in the freedoms that ordinary women have. Now, not only are they supporting economic growth through their own individual decisions, resulting in an economy where wages are higher, and that therefore incentivises technological change, but also these smaller families where wages are higher are better able to afford to apprentice their children, so that helps to build up the skill base in the economy. They're better able to afford to save a little bit for the future. That helps to provide funds for example, the development of family businesses. And also because women's financial independence has enabled them to stand up to these patriarchal practices within the family, I would say that encourages a demand for democracy, democratic citizens. Because in patriarchal families, what happens is young people, whether they are women or men actually, are told to shut up rather than speak up. They're under the thumb of the patriarch. They can't have their own opinions. They have to bow down to the family patriarch. We see that very much, for example, in ancient China, where there is this real reverence to the family patriarchs, not just in the present, but in the past. And so young people are not brought up in a context of questioning, of holding to account, of having their voices heard. Whereas what's happening in Northwestern Europe as women are breaking these patriarchal families is that is a challenge to hierarchical power more generally. It is encouraging people to stand up to autocratic leaders. It's encouraging people to question what they're told, to have their voices heard, to be demanding of greater democracy. And more importantly than that, not just to be demanding of greater democracy, but when democratic institutions are put in place, to be able to keep a check on it in a way that means that democracy isn't overthrown by, another one of the many autocrats that we've had throughout history. So I think actually institutions, if we think about the institutions in the economy, I think it's quite difficult to fully explain the difference in, say, the West compared with some other parts of the world without thinking about that difference in women's lives. And I could go on. Max Weber has talked about the capitalist spirit. We have Jan de Vries has talked about the industrious revolution. So this kind of hard-working, capitalist, entrepreneurial culture. And I think, again, we can't understand that without thinking about women's lives, because what you have in this situation where young people go out to work, start their own families, is a kind of tough love situation where you cannot have a private life, you cannot get married and have children, unless you are financially able to support yourself. Unlike, say, in China, where your parents will arrange a marriage for you and then you're absorbed into their home, and your wealth and your status depends on your parents, depends on your wider family. In Northwestern Europe, really your life depends on you. You will rise or fall depending on what you do with your life. And so there is this drive really to work hard, to be entrepreneurial, to be what we might call capitalist, because if you don't, you have no private life.
Right, well, that's fascinating. There's a whole number of questions I'd like to pick up from that. I was struck by another book as you were talking about men being on the pedestals of the Industrial Revolution, so Daunton and Watts in Birmingham, for example. So you have the book by Jill Mokyr, The Enlightened Economy. They're all men, if I remember correctly.
Absolutely.
You were saying, no, it's the woman who can take decisions on her own, have independence. It's about individualism. Let me just ask you a question as a follow-up there. So you're saying that areas like Bengal and the Yangtze Delta are as prosperous as Northwest Europe at some point in the Middle Ages, early modern period, when women were subordinated. So you're saying that subordination can achieve a high-ish level on a par with Britain, but to go beyond that, to break through that, dare I say, glass ceiling, you need to have the women having power. And you're saying that is what leads to economic growth, rather than economic growth leading to independence.
Absolutely. And actually, I should say, throughout the whole of human history, a very common strategy for communities or states when it comes to trying to become prosperous is to exploit women. Throughout history, women have been controlled and enslaved, whether by states or by families, put to work, whether in a reproductive sense or making cloth. Cloth was the first currency of the global economy, and it was women within either slave workshops in, say, Mesopotamia, or women in peasant households in China under the thumbs of patriarchs producing this cloth. So throughout the whole of human history, the exploitation of women's hard labour has been key to building prosperity, but there is a ceiling that you reach, because it is only when, as individuals, we can take control of our own lives, when we can when we're fully able to use our talents to be creative, when we're not demotivated and stressed by being controlled, that really economies can really start to flourish.
Well, I'm convinced. So the question then follows in my mind, why are economists so neglectful of the role of women, who after all are at least half and probably a bit more of the human race? Could you explain why economists are so blind to what you have just been saying?
So I think, Martin, this very much comes back to a point that you made a moment ago, which is that typically we think of women's rights, women's freedoms as being a product of economic growth rather than a driver of economic growth. And I think we think about that generally in terms of social freedoms, LGBT rights and so on, that these things come after. If only we can get the economy right first, if only we can, raise GDP, then we'll be in a situation where we meet our basic needs first, and then we can afford the luxuries that are women's freedoms and social freedoms more generally. And what I do in the Sex Factor is to turn the table on that and to say, no, women's freedoms need to come first, not second. But I think in the context of where economists have gone wrong here, you think about where we were as we come out of the Industrial Revolution towards the end of the 19th century. And women, as I've argued, have been so important to the British Industrial Revolution and the rise of the West. But women don't get paid back, in a sense, for their contribution. That what you have by the end of the Industrial Revolution is the rise of the male breadwinner family. The ideal that becomes the housewife, the idea that women should now be in the home rather than in the factory. That it's better for the women and it's better for the family and for the wider society if women are the heart of the home. And so at the time that modern economics starts to develop, women are idealised as housewives. They're not seen as economic contributors. Now, actually, they are working very hard still within the home. I mean, when you think about the amount of work it took cooking, cleaning, washing, providing hot meals in the late 19th century and through to the 20th century before modern day appliances, this was hard work. But that wasn't classed as proper work. That wasn't classed as GDP as part of our economy.
It's not in the GDP.
It's not in GDP. So women came to be seen as the housewives rather than as important contributors to the economy. And then as we go into the 20th century, we see the suffragette movement. And so you can see how this rhetoric develops, that women's freedoms come as a consequence of economic growth rather than being a cause of economic growth, because in a sense we ignore the economic history. We don't, as economists, look back far enough in time to the way in which throughout human history the home was actually the heart of the economy. That, the original businesses were based in the home. The original workshops were based in the home. And each mother in her home was like the CEO of the family business and the household. So there's this real blurring between the economy and the home in a way I think that is very much ignored by economists.
Have economic historians been any better? I suppose in the late 19th century there are some economic historians who start to write about this and say something like you've been saying, perhaps, that women have been there. And perhaps there's a sidelight on that. I think the first woman economic historian in Cambridge to hold a position within a college was Ellen MacArthur.
Yes.
And the man who created Cambridge economics, Alfred Marshall, refused to allow her to teach.
Isn't that a travesty?
And the person who did allow her to teach was his great enemy, William Cunningham. So there's a battle going on within the economics profession. So there we are then. Two questions. First of all, were economic historians any better in seeing what you've been actually talking about? And are modern economists perhaps a little bit more enlightened than Alfred Marshall? Is the profession starting to change?
So, such amazing work that was done by female economic historians like Alice Clark and Ivy Pinchback, and continues to be done today by, for example, Amy Erickson in Cambridge, Deborah Oxley, Jane Humphreys, Sarah Horrell. I do think women economic historians have done a wonderful job of really showing us the contribution of women throughout history. I have in front of me here, it is a trade card of a woman shoemaker from 18th century London. And you can see here, so this is the business card of the 18th century, and this shoemaker is called Anna Skew. And she advertises there on her business card the types of shoes that she does, how she can ship them internationally. She makes shoes for men as well as for women. There's a giant boot there on her business card, and it gives details of where you can find her. That was before modern day streets had numbers, and so you'll notice that it says "Find me" by the sign
of this wonderful boot that you have there.
That's right.
And just reading it, she sells all sorts of men's shoes, boots, slippers. Likewise, women's fine shoes, clogs, and slippers. Yes, a wide range.
And so Amy Erickson has done a great job, for example, unearthing these women's business cards from 18th century London. You know, something I think most people would be surprised to see that, because we think of businesses as being run by men. You know, we think of businessmen, not business women. So I do think economic historians have done a relatively better job than economists. And we can see, you know, if we look at the gender gap within economics as a discipline. So, for example, at the moment in the UK, less than a fifth of economic professors are women. If we look at the proportion of undergraduates that are women in economics, that's been falling over time rather than rising. Yes, so in 2002, 31% of British students studying economics were women. By 2018, it was 27%. So it's actually round about a quarter now. So I think about back when I graduated with my economics degree, there were more women studying economics then than there are now, which is a travesty.
Why do you think that's happening?
Why is it happening? Well, I think economics as a discipline has a number of failings that put people off. You know, it isn't doing a very good job of having an understanding of the world around us. When you think about big economic questions, these are questions that women are as interested in as men. You know, boom and bust, rise and fall of civilizations, poverty and inequality. And yet economics as a discipline, I don't think, is doing a very good job of answering those questions. And I think that is putting people off. And instead, women are going to study other things like history or other social science or humanities, sociology. And I think what's quite a travesty within economics departments is that those subjects that can be so useful to economics and that in a sense should be part of an economic syllabus, politics, society, culture, and so on, that is so important if we're to try and understand the economy as a whole, those are seen as soft and unrigorous and feminine, and so not worthy of being included in the highly technical and mathematical economic syllabus. And so it's not surprising really that we are putting people off because economics cannot provide the answers to the questions we have.
So I didn't realise the number of women was actually falling in economics. And falling in the number of people holding permanent posts as well?
So at the staff level, there has been a small improvement, but at the undergraduate level, it's been declining. And so what's happening is at the staff level, increasingly posts are being filled. Of course, we have an international labour market. So, for example, most of my female colleagues are from other parts of the world, Europe, United States, and so on. I think I have been one of the few British-born economists working in Britain.
And do you know if the number of women studying economics at undergraduate level has been falling in other countries as well, or is Britain an outlier? Perhaps you don't know that.
I would have to look at the data. I think in the US it certainly hasn't been a significant increase. So yes,
that's interesting.
Yes.
So it's as you say, this mathematical modelling, which often doesn't take account of gender.
Absolutely, yes. No, absolutely. And make some quite stereotypical assumptions when it comes to gender, I would say. I mean, if we think about let me try and defend economics to begin with, and then I'm going to attack it if I can. So if we think about the context in which modern economics developed, which was the late 19th century, and I've already talked about how that was a period where you're getting the idealization of the housewife. It was a period when we're coming out of the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism is seen as the big thing. And that's very different to the pre-industrial revolution, more medieval economy perhaps, where we had the church and the state were seen as being more in control of our lives. So if we think about the intrusions on people's lives, sumptuary laws that dictated who could and couldn't wear purple, who could and couldn't wear tailored shirts, usury laws that dictated what interest rates, the maximum interest rates you could charge, all kinds of statute of labourers that for a long time dictated, say, wages in the economy. You've got to set up, say, an international trading company, you need a government licence for that. You've got tariffs and so on. And so historically you have the state and the church quite intrude in people's lives. And I would say that what happens with, say, Adam Smith and classical economics is it's trying to make the case that actually you can let individuals make their own decisions. You can trust them to make their own decisions. You don't need to boss them around, tell them what they can and can't earn or what they can and can't spend and where they can buy their purchases from abroad or at home. People are reasoned. This is the rise of the trend in the belief in reason and rationality. We're all reasoned enough to make our own decisions. We don't need to be bossed around by the state and the church. And moreover, if we're left to make our own decisions, that won't lead to chaos. That through the invisible hand of the market, that will lead on aggregate to an outcome in which society is better off rather than worse off. And so we know from Adam Smith this idea of it's not from the benevolence of the butcher or the baker that you get fed, it is from the butcher or the baker appealing to their own self-interest, so their drive to make a profit that in turn provides us with bread and butchery and so on. So I think in that context where economists are trying to make the case for a world in which individuals are freer to make their own decisions, I think you can see how economics starts to go in a direction of saying, people are these kind of rational, reasoned creatures and can be trusted to do their own thing. But I think where economics then goes wrong is as we come out of that classical period of economics, the kind of Adam Smith, late 18th century, early 19th century, and we go into the late 19th century, into the marginal revolution within economics. This is where we get the formalization of economics. And so this idea that we're all these rational, reasoned creatures is set down in a mathematical way, is set down as a kind of scientific model. So economists borrow from physics and think, let's model the economy in the way that you can model, say, a set of atoms. And so let's assume that everyone is rational, reasoned, calculating beings, and let's try and understand the economy through these mathematical models. And so you get this oversimplification that strips economics of all humanity. We become these robotic creatures. And of course, from the point of view of economic history, this is extremely ahistorical, and it is also rather biased against women, because historically, women have been doing a lot of work in terms of reproduction and caring labour and other things within the home, that it's quite difficult to fit into these mathematical models where we're all rational, reasoned, calculating beings. How do you think about things like altruism and love and care for the family in that context? So that whole side of the economy then becomes seen as, this isn't economics, this is something else separate to economics.
Let me just pick up on that, because in the first of these conversations, I had a conversation with Richard Watmore about Adam Smith. And as you say, Adam Smith thought that it's not by benevolence that we're fed, it's the butcher and the bakers self-interest. But Adam Smith also said, didn't he, in the theory of the moral sentiments, it's how we empathise with the person that we're dealing with. You have to be able to put yourself in the shoe of the customer. What does the customer want? So he was not actually going in for that sort of highly mathematical approach, was he? It was much more about human psychology and empathy and moral sentiments. And then I mentioned Alfred Marshall and William Cunningham. And isn't there a battle, as you're saying, in the late 19th century at Cambridge, where economics is really being formalised, where Marshall is going down a mathematical route and his great enemy, Cunningham, saying, no, we have to be historical, we have to think more generally. So is there that battle between the methodology and stride, if I get my German right, between the historical economics and the more mathematical economics, and the mathematical people win?
Yes.
So that's what you're saying. But then, is there, coming back now, behavioural economics, which I was talking to Avner Offer about last time, is that subverting what you were just saying about this highly mathematical, if like unreal view of humanity, in my view?
So I think behavioural economics has made a really important contribution, and actually Nobel Prizes have been awarded, for it. So let me first of all say, this is a really important field of economics. It is about questioning these core assumptions of economics, that we are these rational, self-interested, calculating, independent beings. But I would say that behavioural economics does both too much and too little. So on the one hand, does it do too much? So I certainly wouldn't want to replace the idea that we're all self-interested with the idea that we're all altruistic and nice to each other. Because I think if we do that, if we jump to an opposite kind of set of assumptions, how do we understand exploitation within society? How do we understand exploitation within the home, within patriarchal families and so on? So I think certainly, some economists have jumped to being too optimistic about human nature and thinking that we can perhaps, if we stop assuming people are self-interested and calculating and start believing in the good of all people, then we can create this much nicer society. And I'm more sceptical of that, and perhaps that is seeing from an economic history point of view the amount that women have been exploited throughout history. But on the other hand, I don't think it goes far enough, behavioural economics. And that is because I think that if we're truly to build a better understanding of the economy, we need to think about fertility, we need to think about family, we need to think about society. And I think those things are not fully taken on board within behavioural economics. If we begin with fertility, so if we think about, to be a woman in the world today, your ability to control your fertility is so fundamental to your economic outcomes in life, to your experience of poverty and inequality, for example. An unexpected pregnancy, or being married off as a girl and being doomed to a life of, one child after another within the home over which you have no control. If we're to understand the experience of women's poverty, gender inequality, the politics of the home, we need to think about women's fertility and women's freedom to control their fertility, and to factor that into our economic models. And once you think about fertility, that then leads you to the family. Because again, if we think about these assumptions that economists make, that we are these rational, calculating, independent beings, the reality of fertility and family is dependence. We're not all completely independent beings. We might be dependent on other people, and we might have people that are dependent on us. That is the nature of fertility and the family life that it brings. And so better understanding that dependence and thinking about how that dependence creates the possibility of exploitation, including, say, within the home, I think is really important. So I think that behavioural economics, it's done some wonderful things, but I think sometimes it can be pushed too far, and sometimes there are areas where we need to improve our understanding of the economy, change the way we think about us as individuals in a way that could help us better understand poverty, inequality, and economic growth.
If I were being slightly mischievous, I might say, why do we need economics? What the agenda you're setting out there sounds like sociology. So why don't you become a sociologist?
Oh, well, I would like to see us go back to a period, of the classical days of economics, where economics was a multidisciplinary subject. It was a magpie subject. It took a little bit of history, a bit of sociology, a bit of theology, a bit of politics. That you can't see economics just as something akin to physics. And I think one of the reasons why economists have gone wrong in this, why we have this physics envy, is in part, I guess, a product of the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, because what you get with that is this real, bowing down to science, because technology and science are so important in the Industrial Revolution. The Enlightenment shifts us from this seeing the world, as driven by, magic and fate and heavenly forces, to instead driven by scientific law that we can uncover and try and understand. And so I think there is a sense in that context that economists are thinking science is above the arts, reason is above emotion, and to have a rigorous economics, we therefore need to become very mathematical, very technical, strip out all of these social and cultural things. And in a sense, what happens in economics is you get this idea that everything else can be explained by economics. So material foundations for everything else, that if you want to understand cultural differences, social differences, you just need to reduce it all down to the economic differences.
Yeah. And that's not just Marx, that's not just materialistic, deterministic. You're saying that is throughout the subject.
Throughout the subject.
And that's spreading then into other areas of policy making where it might not be appropriate.
Yes.
So, in a way, you're rolling the clock back in economics to, again, going back to by Bateman, Alfred Marshall, in this comment, I don't know if you really, but it's by Bateman, where you had in Cambridge, before the economic typos, you had the moral sciences typos. So it was a mixture of philosophy, history, they wouldn't call it sociology, but the human sciences.
Yeah.
So that's your vision, but not PPE?
I think what you're describing, Martin, is a wider umbrella than PPE. I think the way PPE is taught is it's quite siloed. Mm-hmm. So you have people teaching the politics, people teaching the economics and the philosophy without necessarily speaking to each other. And so you get, for example, a degree in PPE where it's not necessarily joined up thinking. Yeah.
Right, so what you end up is, dare I say it, certain politicians who've done sort of economics 101, thinking they understand how the economy works. And that's in a silo. Right. You were saying that earlier on that historians have been better. You mentioned very good historians in the past, like Alice Clark, through to today, Jane Humphreys, dare I say you, who have done this wonderful work. But I think also some historians have not been very good. Mm. I'm just thinking about the way some of them have looked at the family.
Yes.
Which you're just talking about. So you mentioned one of the things which leads to breaking through the limits on economic growth being the rights of women to have independence within the labour market and early marriage. So, late marriage.
Yes.
Reducing the number of children. In fact, an awful lot of people in the 18th century never marrying.
Yes, that's right.
But when you look at Tony Wrigley, who really discovered in very great detail that high rate of non-marriage and late age of marriage, I think he sees the decision as being within a frictionless household.
Yes.
That men and women say, what is the nature of the labour market at the moment and what's the price of food? And they sort of sit down with their abacus or whatever it was at the time and they work out, is it wise to get married? There's no power between men and women, I think I'll be fair in saying.
That's right.
Or if you take, you mentioned Jan de Vries, I think,
Yes.
earlier on. He says again, the household works out whether it's worth spending time of the woman in working the labour market, or if you get a bigger marginal return, if the woman, because the man's wage has gone up, spends time at home doing washing and cooking and baking and whatever within the home. So again, it's a frictionless experience within the household. I take it that is not how you see the household, and some economists have tried to model the household, haven't they? Particularly Gary Becker. Now, I just wonder if you could tell our listeners what you think about this way. Both historians and economists have looked at the family.
Yeah, so Gary Becker won a Nobel Prize for importing economic concepts into the household.
Yeah.
So historically, as perhaps we've suggested, economists have been very bad at thinking about the household. The economy is seen as something out there, as separate to the household. And what Gary Becker did was to unlock the black box that is the household, and doing that in a way that imported those economic concepts, those economic assumptions of rationality, calculating, maximising economic agents. And so he modelled the household as having as economists we call it, a joint utility function. So someone in the household takes on the role of thinking about how they're going to maximise the utility or the happiness of the household. And they're then going to arrange the household in a way that maximises that household's happiness. And that might involve, for example, thinking about, right, who's going to go out to work and earn a living? Who's going to stay at home and look after the children? How many children are we going to have? And so on. And so Becker models this all as being a rational, calculating thing. And so he comes to the conclusion that, for example, historically, women have been more likely to stay in the home because they have this comparative advantage when it comes to breastfeeding. And so, it makes more sense for men to go out of the home and earn money because women kind of have this anchor to the home that they're the ones that need to feed the infants, and so it makes more sense for them to stay at home. And so Becker tries to, through importing those economic concepts into the home, try and explain social outcomes like why we tend to have more housewives than house husbands. And I think that on the one hand, this opened economists' eyes to the household, but on the other hand, it gave a very blinkered view of what was going on in the household. And certainly I would say from a woman's point of view, a lot of inequality in society is rooted in the household, that we can't assume that the head of the household thinks altruistically about the whole family and is trying to maximise the happiness of the whole family. There is actually a lot of exploitation that goes on within the household. I've mentioned actually, for example, ancient China, ancient Mesopotamia and so on, where women were under the thumbs of family patriarchs. In China, you have women whose feet are bound or were bound as children, such that they could be effectively chained to the spinning wheel to be producing cloth for the family. And so this suggests that actually, there's a lot of exploitation that is going on within the home, that it is not this happy world where someone is seeking to maximise the happiness of the household. And I think actually it's not just mainstream economists that make this error, it's also Marxist economists as well. And so certainly after the Industrial Revolution, Karl Marx had a view that factory life was bad for women, that women would be better off in the home rather than in the factories. And I think within Marxism in general, there was a view that, women's well-being would be better off. Paid work is exploitative. That we might need, say, family wages for men, men to be earning more so that women can then be in the home looking after the well-being of the wider family. So I think both neoclassical economists and Marxist economists have failed to get to grips with the exploitation that happens within the home and have instead seen it as this seamless place. And you cannot understand, the poverty that women are exposed to, gender inequality in the economy, and how what happens in the home feeds into wider economic outcomes, economic growth in the way that we began at the beginning, without thinking about that true reality of what goes on in the home.
Let me just explore that a little bit more with you. As you've been talking, I've been thinking about work done by Avner Offer, with whom I had the last conversation. And if I remember his work correctly, he looked at the uptake of various new commodities,
Yes.
like colour television sets
Yes.
or washing machines.
Yes.
And what did he find? That the uptake is much quicker on the time-wasting things,
Yes.
like colour television sets, where, stereotyping perhaps a little bit, the head of the household, male head of the household, can
Benefits.
slump in front of the television watching Match of the Day.
Yes.
The uptake of the washing machine, which might reduce the labour of the woman,
Yes.
is much slower. So he's seeing there in spending patterns,
Yes.
not this, what did you call it, utility maximising
Yes.
households, but the way in which it works out differently for men and women. I suppose going back into history, somebody like Eleanor Rathbone
Yes.
in Liverpool,
Yes.
who was a pioneer of family allowances to be paid to the wife, the mother,
Absolutely. Yes.
noticed in the late 19th century that dockers in Liverpool would be paid their wages. They would then go out to the pub and they gambling hall, whatever, and they would hand over to the wife what was left over.
Yeah.
So she was conscious of this power struggle, and I just remember in introducing you come from Oldham,
I do.
which is a spinning town.
Yes.
Where I think most of the men, it was men who worked on the
So the
spinning.
Spinners Union.
Yeah, and the machinery that was introduced, the mule spinning machinery, was intended by the factory owners to replace men by cheap women.
Yes.
The men stopped
Exactly
that.
right.
So you've got this battle going on.
Yes.
In the weaving towns, the women worked on the looms.
Yes.
They had more money.
Yes.
They had more power over the men.
Yes.
And they had later age of marriage.
Yes.
So I think historians are aware of these
They are.
changes.
Yes.
Or not to say mining
Yes.
towns in South Wales, where
Yeah.
I come from.
Yeah.
So economists, you're saying, are not really understanding these social dynamics.
I think they've come later to it,
Right.
and so there's this strange irony that when it comes to life in the market, they're happy to assume everything is self-interested and calculating and so on. And then when it comes to how people behave in the home, there is this view that, that is a place of altruism. That there is this divide between the market in which everyone has to be selfish because businesses will go bankrupt unless you're really hard-nosed. Whereas in the home, that is the place of the housewife, that is the place of love and of altruism. And in a sense, the two kind of balance each other out, that support each other.
Yeah, but that's completely wrong, isn't
Yes,
it?
it is.
Because if you look at the Industrial Revolution, like I don't know, Wedgwood family or whatever,
Yes.
a lot of that is about marriages.
Absolutely.
And marriage brings capital, and marriage
Yes.
brings connection.
Yes.
And you also have the issue about when people die, you have to have executors, and you have
Yes.
to have marriage settlements.
Mhm.
And doesn't this mean that the family is completely implicated into the capitalist economy?
Absolutely. I mean, family businesses have been the mainstay not just of the economy historically, but still today. The majority of businesses out there in the world are family businesses. Historically, what has happened, though, is that businesses are registered under male names, and so the contribution of the wives and daughters behind the scenes is ignored, and hence we have this concept of the businessman that overlooks actually the work that wives and daughters were doing. We think of someone like Bertha Benz. Do you know the story of Bertha Benz?
No.
So the wife of Carl Benz. So he pioneered the motor car, was working away in his workshop. She was there helping him. He wasn't convinced that the motor car was up for a trial run. She was. She'd been working with him.
Yeah.
She felt, and so early one morning, she wheeled the motor wagon out of the barn, and she decides she's going to take it on the first trial run of a car in the whole of history. She takes it across Germany, through the countryside. Really? She's overtaking people on horses. She's shocking people at work in the fields. And the car is breaking down along the way, and each time she's solving it, she removes her garter to solve the problem. She finds a way of keeping the fuel tank full. She thinks on her feet, and shows therefore how involved she was in that family business. So women have always been really hard at work within family businesses. But I think what's interesting is when you look at census takers, for example, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they decide to not classify women who are working in family businesses as working. Well. So women working on family farms or in family businesses or even running B&Bs, they are seen as inactive dependents on men. Right. Which comes back to this point that the people that are in charge of, say, measuring the economy are really not counting this work that's done by women, which implicitly suggests perhaps they don't think it's important.
So this goes back to the GDP, not counting it. As you were talking, I've got two thoughts going through my mind. We were talking about the Emma Rathbone family allowances.
Yes.
Which of course doesn't come until very late in Britain.
Yes.
Was it 48, I think?
Yes.
Something like that.
Yes.
It's earlier, I think, in France.
Yes.
So you have differences, but even within Europe, you have male breadwinner welfare state in Britain, where benefits go to men, trade unionists, whereas in France, through social Catholicism, it goes to women, more maternal. Yes. So we should be looking at the state within this as being more or less patriarchal. I'll come back to that in a minute. Property. We're talking about family property, which makes me think about inheritance practices. Now, you were saying how the West is best always in terms of women's rights, but I think that within Sharia law, women have definite inheritance rights, whereas not necessarily within English inheritance law. I mean, it varies. French. So I just wondered, could you say a little bit about property rights and how that affects women in different periods, different times?
So you're right that historically under Islamic law, a daughter was entitled to half of the inheritance of a brother. So she was entitled to some inheritance. Whereas historically in, say, Britain, you would have a system of primogeniture, and so it would be the eldest son that would inherit. I think what's interesting is when it comes to actual practice, when you look at, for example, business directories, when you look at women's involvement in family businesses, is the number of businesses that are inherited by widows. And widows are looking after those businesses. And in a sense, they might be seen as Field and Sons or Jones and Sons. But actually it is the mother is inheriting the business from the father. The fact that she is inheriting it and keeps it running is indicative of how involved she is in the business. So I think there is theory and there is practice. I would say that no economy scores perfectly on all the measures of women's rights. Where the Middle East historically scored best was in terms of property rights, so in terms of women's ability to inherit and women's ability to have a dowry and to look after that dowry. Though I think that is indicative of women not being expected to make their own financial contribution in marriage, and so they have to bring it in via what their father gives them when they get married. So, mixed bag there. But in Muslim societies, at the beginning of Islam, you have, for example, Khadija. She is the wife of Muhammad. She is a merchant, and she actually proposes to Muhammad. She's older than him. She employs him as one of her contractors, and she proposes to him. They get married, and she's the first Muslim, actually, Khadija. So early on in the days of Islam, you have this active involvement of women, people like Khadija. You go through an Islamic golden age, of course, in the 800s, the 900s, when the Middle East was really, when Europe was in the Dark Ages, if I can call it the Dark Ages. You've got the rise of Islam, women quite actively involved, but you get this backlash against women's involvement in the economy. You get this increasing seclusion of women, increasing veiling of women. They do, to a degree, hold on to this property right in terms of the ability to inherit and to look after their dowry, but their other rights and freedoms are being eroded over time. So, yes, it's a mixed bag.
And now property is mainly, wealth is mainly men.
Right.
We have the Taylor Swift
we do.
phenomenon, but
So,
Elon Musk,
yes.
Jeff Bezos, is it still that property is largely male?
It is, sadly. So we know about income inequality, we know about the gender gap when it comes to income. So we know, for example, the gender pay gap is 23% worldwide. We know that if you factor into that the proportion of women that don't work, that means that overall, all women earn in total about 57% of what men earn. Because you've got those that are earning 23% less, plus those that are earning 0% of what men are earning. So overall, women, in terms of income, earn about 57% of what men do. But the gap in wealth, we think, is much bigger. But the problem is, economists haven't been very good at measuring the gap in wealth. They've instead focused on incomes. But what evidence we do have suggests, for example, if you look at the very top of the ladder of wealth, if you look at global billionaires, so people like the Taylor Swifts and the Oprah Winfreys, if wealth was more evenly distributed, you would have 6 times as many Taylor Swifts and Oprah Winfreys out there as you do. Wealth at the top is heavily distributed towards men. If you look at land holdings, now again, looking at the proportion of landowners across the world that are women versus men, there really isn't enough data yet on this, and there needs to be a big push to do that. But what estimates we do have suggest that women own less than 20% of the planet, essentially. And so the gaps in wealth are much bigger than the gaps in income. And that in turn affects women's ability to, for example, start businesses, to be entrepreneurial. So that kind of capital gap, in a sense, is really significant, much more significant than the gender pay gap that we're more used to talking about.
Interesting. Let me move on to a point I was just hinting at there. I was talking about the welfare state, how the state is structured. And in the last conversation I had with Avner Offer, we spent a lot of time talking about his recent book about what is the role of the state and collective ownership as against private ownership, and it has particular views on that. You talk about this a little bit within your book, the sex factor. I wonder if you could explain your views on this, about whether it's markets versus the state. Or if it's actually about how they work
together
with each other. I suppose one could say that another failing of economics, we really are giving this subject a little bit of a bashing, is to say that they don't say very much about the collective areas of the economy since the market turn. So I wonder, could you give us your view on this?
So certainly we think about this big battle that really hung over the 20th century, the battle between the market and the state, or between capitalism and communism. It was played out in movies, it was played out on our TV screens, it was played out in the space race, so this battle between markets and the state. And I think, well, one thing is that ignores everything that goes on beyond the market and the state, like the household, community, society. But another thing is, I think that in a sense, the most successful economies are those that try and take the best of both worlds, that are not really at one extreme or another. They take the best of both worlds. And I think actually women's freedom is key to getting the best of both worlds, because I think what you get in a society where ordinary women are able to go out to work and to build a life for themselves, first of all, you get that resistance to those patriarchal family practices that we talked about at the beginning. The fact that you can't speak up, you've got to shut up within a patriarchal family. You're under the thumb of the patriarch. And so you have that hierarchy within the home translates into a hierarchy at the level of the state, whereby the citizens are expected to shut up rather than speak up. And so you have a very autocratic type of state as opposed to a democratic one. So I think actually women's freedom is helps us to develop a state that is more democratic, more looking out for the interests of the majority as opposed to a minority. And also I think women's freedom helps to develop better markets. And one of the ways that it does that is that if you have a more traditional patriarchal society, where you have these patriarchal extended families, multiple generations, say, living together, what you have is a situation where each family is like its own mini state. It provides for its own welfare needs. So the wealthier members of the family subsidise the less wealthy ones. The more able ones take care of the ones that might be sick or young or ill. They provide for their own self-defense needs. The muscular younger members of the family will go out and beat up anyone who is acting against the interests of the family. I'm thinking here, mafia-style southern Italy in a very stereotypical sense. Whereas if you have instead a society more like develops in northwestern Europe, where young women are able to smash that type of patriarchal family by being able to work, develop their own financial independence. And so with that, you get this movement towards these smaller, more nuclear homes, is no single family can be its own island. You can't provide everything for yourself. You have to trade and deal with and think about other families around you in order to meet the needs of survival. And I think that helps to develop a underlying trust between members of society that are not part of the same family. And that, I think, helps markets to be deeper and to function better. Whereas what you had, say, historically in the Middle East is you have these very strong extended family networks that are wonderful in the early days of economic history, because that supports trade across long distances, because you'll have a cousin or a second cousin somewhere that you can make contact with. But what that doesn't do is to encourage that generalised trust that goes beyond the family. So I think actually women's freedom, what's happening in the lives of ordinary women is both helping markets develop and work better, and is helping the state to develop and work better, and so providing us with the best of both worlds.
So in a way, you're saying, going back to the Industrial Revolution, you have the late age of marriage, you have the independence of women. People leave the family at a young date to go and work elsewhere, but they can do that also because the state has the poor law, which means it's safe to leave the house.
It's safe to leave the household.
And you're not dependent upon kinship, so it's they're supporting each other.
Exactly.
Let's move to perhaps a final area here, because as you were talking, the thought of President Trump was coming across my mind, because some of the people on the right of the economics profession and of the political spectrum in the States, like is it Kotlikov, is saying, look, the problem is the cost of benefits is dragging down society, the national debt is too high, we're going bankrupt, we need to go back to family responsibility. So there's this pushback. Now, in your book, Naked Feminism, I think you talk in there about what you call a cult of female modesty.
That's right.
There are these like swings about women having to be modest and to cover their body and to wear veils, seclude themselves and so on. And other times where it goes the other way. Could you tell me a little bit about why you think that swing happens?
Yeah.
And if we are now perhaps at risk, particularly in the United States, of a swing back to a sort of like Margaret Atwood and Maiden's Tale sort of vision of the future. So I've been to your views on where we are there.
Absolutely. So Naked Feminism, my most recent book, was a natural follow-on in a sense from The Sex Factor, because what I tried to do with The Sex Factor was to show how important women's contribution is for the economy. And that then left me a question, why is it that you get in some societies and some communities so much resistance to women's involvement in the economy, given that actually, at the family level, we're less poor, at the society level, we're more prosperous if women are actively involved and treated the same as men, essentially. And so I thought about, why is this? Why is there this resistance? And I came to the conclusion it's the cult of female modesty. And if you think about all of the different obstacles that women face across the world, the things that harm them, the things that stand in their way, of the progress. If you think about, there are some horrific things here like female genital mutilation, virginity testing, forced veiling in Iran. In Afghanistan, the withdrawal of girls from school and the withdrawal of women from the workplace. If we think about the denial of women's access to contraception, so many of these, child marriage actually, so many of these things really are rooted in what I call the cult of female modesty, which is the way in which societies can have a tendency to place a woman's worth, her economic value, on her bodily modesty. So see the degree to which she is valued as a person as being dependent on the degree to which her body has been seen or touched. Now, if you believe that a woman is only worthwhile if she's this pure vessel, then that leads to social practices and government policies that try to protect their all-important modesty. So whether that is, for example, female genital mutilation that involves making it very difficult for women to have intercourse, whether it is forced veiling, whether it is thinking twice before allowing your daughter to go to university, thinking twice before allowing your wife to go into the workplace, resistance to birth control with a view that that could turn your daughter into a harlot, that she might be off doing things that you'd rather she didn't before marriage, child marriage, which is a way of trying to make sure that your daughter's purity isn't eroded by her being out there in the world before she's got married. You want to marry her when she's at her most pure. So I think the cult of female modesty actually stands in the way of women's lives and their ability to get educated, to be healthy, to engage in paid work. And I would say that across history, the pendulum has swung. And actually in many of the historic economic hotspots, like ancient Egypt, ancient Persia, ancient Pakistan and India, women were pretty equal to men. In fact, in ancient Persia, apparently there was no pay gap. No. And women were building pyramids in ancient Egypt along with men. In the Indus Valley civilization, certainly what archaeology we have there suggests that, for example, female burials were on a par with male burials, suggesting a degree of gender equality. But what then happened over time was that you got a backlash against women's freedoms. And I think what happens is women become seen as the scapegoats. Women's freedoms become seen as the scapegoat for all of the man-made or other problems. If there's a flood, that's because the heavens have decided we've got too much harlotry going on in our society. We need to crack down on women and then we'll please God and we'll stop further floods. If society is seen as breaking down, well, that's because women are not in the home, being good wives and mothers. So we need to kind of pull them out of education, pull them out of the workplace. So I think you get these backlashes really against women's freedom, and that then, of course, sets a snowball effect in motion whereby you go from the rise of the economy to the decline of the economy. And I think what's been important about the West is you've certainly seen backlashes against women's freedom. You saw it in the 17th century. I mean, think about witch trials, for example. You saw it in the 19th century with the valorization of the housewife and marriage bars, and so women, married women being locked out of the workplace, the development of marriage bars. So you get these backlashes, but generally women have been able to resist and get things back on track. But I am worried that what we're facing today in Western societies, as well as in, for example, Iran and Afghanistan, where you've seen a backlash against women's rights, that we're seeing something similar. And I think particularly in Trump America.
And how do you explain that? Obviously, there's an issue about women's right to their own body. I think it's right to say that Trump has mainly had votes from men, and Harris had more votes from women, although it varied, I think, between white and black women, if I remember correctly. So why do you think there is this backlash going on there now? Perhaps more in the United States than in this country, although I suppose even here, certain things which are like what is women's issues, like social care, are not having the attention that they deserve.
No, absolutely. The crisis in care, one of the biggest crises we face, I think, as a society. I would say historically, based on my book, there are 3 factors that really stand out as driving the pendulum in the direction of greater seclusion of women or withdrawal of women. One is rising inequality. So where you see rising inequality, then there is competition for jobs, there's competition for economic resources and so on, and a feeling that women are a threat to what might be seen as men's jobs or men's resources within the economy. And also a feeling that, particularly if you've got rising levels of income inequality combined with high levels of gender inequality, that the way for a woman to achieve a better life for herself is for her to marry up. And that if she's to marry up, she needs to be guaranteed to be a pure vessel for the passing on of the inheritance of her new husband. So daughters, if you're from a poor family, and if it's difficult as a woman to make your own living in life, then perhaps the best that can happen to you is to be married into a rich family. But that rich family, who are thinking ahead to inheritance, not going to want you unless you can prove that you are a pure, you're not already impregnated by somebody else, that you're going to be true to your husband, that you're not going to have an affair and actually have him bringing up children and passing on his inheritance to someone who isn't his own, offspring. So I think you tend to find in history where you've had periods of rising inequality and where particularly you've had rising economic inequality and gender inequality together, then that has pushed particularly poorer families in the direction of secluding their daughters and trying to place their value on them as being pure vessels. I think also where you've seen periods of rising population growth, or perhaps I should say actually excessive population pressure. Because if people are feeling, for example, in a cost of living crisis, where food prices are rising, oil prices are rising, property prices are rising, then people perhaps think, can we cope with more people on the planet? And so sex in general becomes demonized, and women as the people that through sex produce other people become particularly demonized. And so women's sexuality becomes demonized. And so harlotry gets a kind of a bad name and is something that people want to crack down on, to control, in a sense, who is and isn't reproducing within the society. And then the final thing is warfare. So where you get periods of quite intense warfare, women that are out there in society are seen as potential victims of warfare. Rape has always been sadly a weapon of war, and so the idea you might want to veil them and seclude them to protect them. But also, women who are out there in society are seen as potentially running off with the enemy, and so violating the tight community that is trying to defend itself against its enemies. So historically, rising inequality, population pressures, and increased warfare are what brings this turn against women's freedoms and this push to seclude women. And I do wonder if at least some of those factors are playing into what's happening today.
So as you were talking there, I thought there's a link between voting for Trump and hostility to immigration,
Yes.
which is your
Yes.
pressure point.
Yes.
A lot of the men who voted for Trump are in Rust Belt
Yes.
states where their
Yes.
sense of manhood
Yes.
is being threatened by loss of jobs in those traditional heavy industries.
Yes.
So you would see that as being part of.
I would.
Of
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Well, we're recording this podcast between the presidential election and the inauguration. So we're now thinking about what will happen after the inauguration and what will happen to women's rights, to their bodies in the United States of America. I think we better stop at that point before we become a little bit too upset or overwrought, like blood pressure rising as we think about what the prospects might be. This has been the last of 3 talks with Richard Watmore and Avner Offer. We've explored a lot of issues about the nature of economics, how to think about the economy. Thank you, Victoria, for giving us your insights in this, and look forward to reading your next book.
Thank you. And let me just say, at a time when women's rights are under threat across the world, it is so important that we do recognise the historical contributions of women. Because I do think by better appreciating that, we can actually resist and stand up to those that are trying to stamp on women's rights, whether it's in Iran or Afghanistan or in the West.
Thank you very much.